Thank you, Kelly. I now invite Dr. Vishvesh Kandolkar to address us, and he'll also begin his presentation. Dr. Kandolkar is the Vice Principal and Associate Professor at the Goa College of Architecture, Goa University. His research on Goa's architectural history focuses on early modern church design, as well as the evolution of Indo-Portuguese aesthetics from the colonial to the post-colonial period. His PhD research was on the visual history of the Basilica of Bom Jesus, among the few monuments to have survived the steady decline of Old Goa, the erstwhile capital of the Estado. Kandolkar's art installation series, This Is Not a Basilica, drew from his research about the Basilica and was exhibited at Sunaparanta at the show Goa Time That Was. His writing has appeared in peer-reviewed journals including World History Bulletin, Verge, Studies in Global Asia, the Oxford Journal of Hindu Studies, eTropic, the Journal of Human Values, and Economic and Political Weekly. Vishvesh.
My first thanks is to the students who have come here from Goa College of Architecture. And it took some time because we were bringing the bus all the way from Altin to here. So thank you all for joining us with public transport or Goa College of Architecture transport. So welcome. I would, take this opportunity to thank Fulbright, Kelly Woods, especially to think about this project of having involving students. And I thought it was a great idea, and I didn't know how much work it would take. But it was a great idea, and then with that in mind, it was very easy with combining with Sunaparanta because most of the work in Sunaparanta was doing it, both Leandre and the team, Nilima, Abhiked, and others. So thank you so much for making this possible. Last of all, I think so. Last of many of them is all the speakers who have come today to speak, because I think so. It's kind of we're trying to bring in speakers who would represent different kinds of teaching history or learning history, and we thought that the exercise sometimes might not necessarily gel together, but it's collectively all the speakers speaking across the forums might maybe make some sense about how do we unpack learning and teaching history. So many of them are teachers of history, or if not teachers of architectural history to be specific, and of course curator of a museum, and apart from that, we also have a combination with Goa University also participating in it. So in that sense, welcome, among others. I'm going to, I think so one of the reasons I put myself first is not to have two presentations together, telling and thanking, but also trying to do jumping quickly to the presentation itself. Yeah, so I'll begin my presentation, and before I delve into and show you some slides, I just want to also tell you all the frustration or the difficulty in really doing this process of teaching history and learning history of Goa. So in that sense, I'm going to focus on three things, and I'm just proposing your way of thinking. So there these three things which I've put together do not necessarily speak very clearly with each other, but they are there. So I just want to propose a few ideas together why it is difficult to teach or learn about Goan history in that sense. So first among this, which I will present, is some works that I've been doing on 19th century history about Richard Burton and what he has to say. And then I'll move on to think about the exchange with some scholars in Portugal and how do they think about Goan history. And finally, a few comments by Teodonio and others who have done actual research on looking at archives and thinking about, not necessarily thinking about architecture, but I'm going to bring that aspect here. So first of all, I think so Burton for me is interesting. Richard Burton, if you know 19th century, I think so I prefer to work with Vivek among others. Like, apparently Vivek says he's his favorite author, 19th century, for many reasons. But Burton has done good service to Goa in terms of putting Goa on the map, but disserviced in many other ways, which I'm going to talk about. One of the things he says is that the opening quote on the 92 page is that the readers who know anything of India will at once perceive the difference between English and Portuguese life in the East. The former is stormy from perpetual motion, the latter stagnant with long continued repose. Now, again, I want to put this too, because here is a British officer coming reflecting in Goa, thinking about Goa, and thinking about British on one hand as somebody who is in motion, who is having this whole legacy of doing something, and then he's looking at the Portuguese and saying, here they are doing nothing, or they are slow, or they are. This is 19th century. And I opened this presentation by looking at Burton because, in that sense, his travelogue, Goa and the Blue Mountain, especially looking at his account of architecture in Goa. While scholars have researched Burton's travel account to examine him as a translator, they've explored him as an explorer, an ethnographer, his encounter with architecture of places he visited have not received enough attention. In a bid to showcase the Portuguese Empire's failure, Burton's travelogue employs lengthy descriptions of the ruined imperial architecture of Portuguese Goa. However, what gets lost when the architectural history of Goa becomes a site for contestations between two European empires is the agency and participation of indigenous people as equally important contributors of their culture and built environment, even within the colonial milieu. Burton's 19th century text indicates how Goan legacies of architectural designs have been subsumed by colonial myth-making, a trend that continues to this date. This presentation focuses on decolonizing Portugueseness of Goan architecture, and by doing that, I'm just going to touch on a few parts. Now, I just want you to also understand that, in terms of, this is the image which is the NC Cathedral, and that architecture is something which is, as a model, as a art, is always integral part of the thing. I think so. This is Saint Jerome, if I'm not mistaken. There's also a similar one of St. Augustine holding another model of the church. Essentially, the fact that patron saints, among others, is holding this architecture, which means architecture or the model of it is very integral to the part of history itself, right? And then we have this contemporary image, again, like I said, I'm going to put these disparate things together of how it says that, we need to uncover this history of Goa. So every time somebody is coming here or doing something, there is this whole point about discovering this history of Goa. And this is the kind of, two times of history that we are living in. One which is Portuguese and having a long legacy, so to say, Portuguese. Another one is trying to discover it again and again. Now, what happens when we want to decolonize Burton? And I was struggling, this word colonize, a colonial thinking on one hand, and to decolonize. And with this respect, I tried to write to many scholars, including Kelly, among others, to try to find these things. I said, I really want to decolonize this history. What does it mean? Some people asked me. So here I'm going to just speak from actual exchange from some scholars. I'm not going to name them, but here is the actual exchange. So I said, I want to decolonize Burton's account because it looks at Portuguese and British history, and Goan history gets forgotten. So how do I go back to the past? And I write to inquire about the construction of history of early modern monuments of Estado da Goa. And I said, you have been working on Goa or whatever. And this is a common email I sent to many. And I would request if you could help me find some data which would give some figures about the origins of native masons, carpenters, ironsmiths, general labor use in the construction of these monuments. And I said, Basilica, for instance, I know that there is Jesuits among others, and there is this references which are there. So can you help me on that? And the reply was, of course, there's a reply lengthy thing, among other things, but also there's something over a few emails, there's something which struck me, and the reply was that there is no doubt in my mind that these locals participated in everything. This is the reply. The question for me is, what that decolonizes? For me, it doesn't decolonize anything, knowing that local carpenters did the work. Of course they did. If they did have slaves, does that decolonize the history? For me, it is important to know who decided it, who drew it, and who built it in order to understand why buildings are the way they are. Building is always a result of teamwork, which is contradiction, which I would say. But as an architect, for me, this is quite clear. Now, if you can see that, and we are also, many of us are architects, so if you can see, what we're doing is this modern construction of architect as a master builder, as that person who has a single pen stroke, draws a line and that becomes a reality. That becomes central to something which is happening in the past itself. So my question then is that how do we really recover this history of something which is indigenous? It's really difficult because if Portuguese scholars and apart from that the British and the Portuguese history, if we keep on fighting with this kind of narrative, then Goan history is completely lost and there's no way back. So in that sense, therefore my struggle was then how do I see these monuments? And I just wanted to show you a few slides. Okay, I mean this is part of the other narrative that everybody wants to come back home to Goa and want what is so-called Portuguese houses. So I'm just putting these things. By Goa is a site apparently. 2 coconut trees represents Goa, but what they're selling is properties in Goa which are Portuguese, right? And this is many people have written about it, including Paulo Gomes, Vivek, Amita, many others, who are saying that why this category Portuguese itself is problematic, and it does keeps repeating itself, right? So I mean, some of you outsiders. So-called outsiders and everything want to have Portuguese houses. This is the website, by the way. And then the whole narrative about Goa itself that, okay, here, welcome, it's beach, churches, Goa, right? So then I'm just going to show you some monuments. Here, it's a wedding on the left. Right on the side is Sharam, if I'm not mistaken. You can look at some Goan houses just to showcase some houses. Right? This is in Kandaling. And then this thing that I've been writing previously, that if you want to have a piece of Goa, you must become a piece of Goa. So there's this whole narrative that how do you make a piece of Goa and then reconstruct its history and try to then recreate this past in the present. So how do you reconcile with this bombardment that we are in, which makes it even more difficult to go back to our past and say we want to recover architecture history. If we can create one now of Portuguese history and Portuguese bungalows, how do we recover it? It's not. And there are many more. I don't want to show you slides and details of it, among others, how they're trying to create Portuguese ambience among others, right? Windows, shell windows, among others. So I don't take too much time, and of course they say all these things and they give you this, so just be aware. They'll give you Manhattan type villas after telling you Portuguese and among other things, right? So this is the airport in Bangalore. So it's not even being sold in Goa itself, it's being sold elsewhere. So this was the image which I was saying. So how do we keep on discovering the architecture of Goa and refiguring traces of Goan architecture through some of the, and then here we are, this monuments, and this is 19th century pictures by Suzanne Paul, just to show you some of the monuments which were built and the contestations that historians have that we really need to find who is the architect. This church is interesting because the architect apparently is lying at the crossing of the church, right? He's buried there, and you're supposed to think that that's the most important person. So if that is the architect who is buried at the crossing, then that's the significance of architect. So students, you have some hope. Find a church and a crossing, and then a patronage, because you need to also support it. But if you see the graves which are there in the churches, you couldn't just be buried there. You had to pay lots of money to either upkeep the church or you had to give some patronage. So that's another talk. Right, so just show you some of the monuments. St. Anthony's inside. And of course, then this whole category of colonial, and then we then want to go and recover the past, and we have the word pre-colonial, right? So when we go back and say, if this belongs to pre-colonial period, then we really center again the colonial itself, or post-colonial. So within colonial milieu, we start having these categories which becomes again problematic. I've just put these slides down, but then I want to go back to now some things which were then Antonio de Souza's work, and he was really in medieval Goa. He was putting this history in place. The book is written in 1979, quite early, and some of the things are very useful. So on page 122, he writes about guilds of artisans and craftsmen in Goa, and he says that there were proper guilds, referring to some of the earliest archives, the Jesuits' missionary reports, which dates back to 1545. In this report, there is a mention of an excellent native painter who was Mukaddam, or superintendent of all other painters. That Goa was an integral trading center even before the arrival of the Portuguese is a sufficient indication that the merchants and craft guilds were flourishing here. This is a quote from Teodonio. Furthermore, unquote, the Portuguese transplanted to Goa, this is still his quote, sorry. Transplanted to Goa the system of guilds, administrators that prevailed in metropole, which is Lisbon, which dates back to 1535 and 37. And these regulations were updated in 1616. Okay, all these documents are there. Now, what are these regulations? These new regulations, which was done in 1616, show high degree of complexity on how the guilds of masons, stone cutters, jewel cutters and polishers, wax workers, coopers, tailors, dyers, washermen, you have it, personal makers, among others, right? So all these guilds are there. And consider that most of these guilds, masons, stone cutters, tile breakers, which are all important to make these monuments, consider that they are integral to the construction and maintenance of the building. Moreover, the period of these new regulations coincide with that period of which most of the significant monuments in Old Goa were built, which I've shown you previously, right? Which is, like for example, Bom Jesus consecrated in 1605, St. Augustine Convent in 1608, Sea Cathedral, long time to build but finished in 1652. So these guilds which are recorded are similar time to all the monuments which are built in Old Goa, right? So in that case, it is one thing for architectural historians to trace the archive of Portuguese Goa for record of who were the original architects of these buildings, those lying in the crossings, or for that matter, the original European buildings, because they are either patronized by the crown or patronized by Jesuits or other orders which are coming from other places. It's one thing to recover those patrons or those categories which we say, these are the people who have done it, Portuguese or religious orders which are coming from elsewhere. But another thing to say that, no, this is not necessarily them, but it's all these people who are involved in the construction of Goan entity itself. So in that sense, in decolonial architectural history of Goa, we need to consider how construction of these monuments were very much legacy of local native Goans and native guilds that shaped this architecture. Additionally, the patrons, which is religious orders and the state, did not just hire craftsmen on daily wage basis, but masons and carpenters had to present a guarantee equivalent to the 1/3 of the value of the work undertaken. Again, quoting details because they were not just hired, they had to give guarantee that this work will be done to your satisfaction, which means they were investing their own money. If such were the conditions of contract, how can we forget their legacies today and only imply that the work of this so-called Portuguese authorship only because chief engineers were Portuguese or that Portugal was ruling Goa at that time? Lastly, De Souza Santos mentions that majority of artisans in Goa were non-Christians. He's saying that, and this is early, okay, this is 1545, so surely there is a different thing happening in the 16th century, 17th century. And that these craftsmen largely belonged to the Bojan caste and labor was sourced from slave workers. Shows that the heritage of Goa is much more a legacy of ordinary people, undermining the legacy of Europe and instead foregrounding the legacy of Goans belong to different religion, caste, race, economy, and even gender, because if you see many times we undermine the role of gender in construction itself. So to summarize, it's difficult to recover, but in order to recover the history or trace the history, we need to get across those curtains, whether they're contemporary or those ones which are forged by differences between British and the Portuguese, among others. So it will take some efforts for us to breach that, but once we do that, we can really recover the history or trace back the history, which is truly a Goan history. Thank you so much.